Be going through the aloneness argument against divine simplicity. Now, as far as I'm aware, this argument was first introduced by Joe Schmidt and Ryan Mullins in a paper they both co-authored together. And you don't really see this argument being ran as much by, I guess, just like the average person, because it's a lot more technical than other arguments, at least in its formulation and it's in its defenses. So first, let's just get the argument out there. I'm going to read out all of the premises for you guys. So premise 1 reads as follows. God's knowledge is either wholly intrinsic to God, wholly extrinsic to God, or intrinsic to God in some respects, but extrinsic to God in others. Premise 2. God's knowledge is wholly extrinsic to God, or intrinsic to God in some respects, but extrinsic to God in others, only if God doesn't exist alone. Premise 3. Possibly God exists alone. Premise 4. So possibly God's knowledge is wholly intrinsic. Premise 5. Necessarily, God contingently has some knowledge. Premise 6. So possibly God contingently has wholly intrinsic knowledge. Premise 7. Whatever is wholly intrinsic to S is either an essential feature of S or an accident of S. 8. Nothing God contingently has can be an essential feature of God. 9. So possibly God has an accident. 10. If DDS is true, it is not possible that God has an accident. 11. So DDS is false. I've seen the real points of contention is premise 2 and 5. Some people object to premise 3. I think implicitly Gavin Kerr does it in his defense, because he says it doesn't really make sense to say God exists alone, because God is always alone in a sense. But the defense that I'll be sort of catering to is Gavin Kerr's defense. Now, he wrote a paper, and that paper is called God and the Alone World, which is a direct response to Joe Schmidt and Ryan Mullins' paper. And I think it is an amazing response, so we'll be going based off that. So the first thing you have to understand is how humans gain knowledge according to the Thomistic position that Gavin Kerr is defending. And it's sort of your normal sort of representationalist picture of knowledge. First you have reality, then you have our bodies of sense, our senses capturing sense data, and then you have the representation going into our mind, our cognition. Something to sort of mirror how this functions is sort of like how a computer gets information when you download something new, and it alters the software of the computer, or alters the machinery internally of the computer. In the same way, humans go from a state of being ignorant about something to having some representation of something, which means there's some intrinsic change to the cognition of the human being. Now, if all knowledge functioned in that way, this argument would have no problems. It would go through pretty easily. But under the Thomistic account of divine knowledge, God does not know things by abstracting from the world. Instead, it's sort of reversed in the way that humans gather knowledge from the outside world. God knows things by knowing his divine essence, which is not a relation to something other than himself. And through knowing the divine essence, he knows the possible ways in which his power is expressible in worlds. And so the account of knowledge that we have here is that necessarily God knows himself. Necessarily God knows the ways his power is expressible. And necessarily in every world, God knows the truth value of that world, of whatever proposition is in that world. But that doesn't mean that there's an intrinsic change in God. because God has a single act of self-knowing. Which now I'm going to put some formalizations on the screen so that if you guys want to plug it in, you can see how this works. Or I know a lot of you study analytic philosophy and formal language, so it'll be good for you guys to see it this way. So the first formalization reads as necessarily God knows himself. The second formalization reads, by knowing himself as cause, God necessarily knows every creaturely possibility. The third is, creaturely propositions themselves are contingent. And for the final formalization, it reads, necessarily, if P is true, God knows P. And if P is false, God knows that P is false. So notice how none of this transfers the knowing of P into something internal to God. Rather, the knowing of P sort of works like a function where you have inputs and outputs. And so God's act of self-knowing is perfectly preserved. And so from our standpoint, where we use possible world semantics to describe the relations of things that could be a certain way, we can say that in possible world 1, possible world 2, possible world 3, God knows all true propositions in those worlds. God knows what is true, God knows what is false. But that does not force you to say that there's an intrinsic change in God. Now, if we did what Joe Schmidt did in his paper, where we say God contingently has some knowledge, where has stands as not just a true predicate of God, but a property of God, what he's doing is he's attaching the truth value to, or a change in any truth value ranging across possible worlds to an intrinsic change in God. But that's exactly the human account of knowledge, right? Because it makes sense that if you have a representation from the world, that it's going to be, you're going to go from a state of ignorance to a state of knowing. And in the human mind, we're not infallible creatures. We don't have a single act of self-knowing through which we're the cause of all things. So it's sort of like downloading a software in a computer where we go from not knowing to knowing. But God, being the cause of all things, knows his power directly through the things that he causes. Or he knows his power directly through knowing himself in the world where there are no causes yet, or he has not caused contingent beings to exist yet. And so the argument that Joe Schmidt wrote assumes God is property bearer of knowledge, but that's not how that functions. God is all-knowing, and by that we mean God knows himself perfectly, and he knows the way in which his power is perfectly imitable.